Alright, today, very briefly, we're going to go over the American literature timeline, which roughly covers from 40,000 BC to present. These are all the examples of texts we'll be going over throughout this year. So first of all, we have the 40,000 BC to 20,000 BC, and that's typically the Native American era. Typically, these were oral literature, so oral stories, and they used them to teach lessons. And what else? Very easy. To understand the world. We've already discussed this through our creation myths. But the key aspect is all this was oral literature. They didn't have writing just yet. Alright, moving on. Next up we have 1600 to 1800, which is Puritanism. Most of this were mostly diaries and histories which express connections between God and everyday life. Now, during this time period, the Puritans, they actually, of course, moved over to America because they sought to purify the Church of England by reforming to the simpler forms of worship and church organization described in the New Testament. So they saw religion as a personal inner experience. And they typically used a plain style in writing. Very, very boring. That's why it's so hard sometimes to read these things. More often than not, notable authors you'll see in this are William Bradford, Anne Bradstreet, or Edward Taylor. Typically, what you'll find are either diaries or poems. So keep that in mind. Diaries or poems are what you would find. Alright, moving on. We have from 1750 to 1800 was rationalism. During this time, we of course had the Revolutionary War. The Constitution was created. The Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence were created. So of course they called this time period, the Age of Reason. So it mostly comprised of philosophers. And I have my very, very terrible version of Benjamin Franklin drawing right there. And the belief is that humans can arrive at truth or God's rules by using deductive reasoning. So logic. So rather than relying on the authority of the past or on religious faith or intuition, use deductive reasoning to come up to these truths. Some notable authors during this time, of course, are good old Ben Franklin, Patrick Henry, who we've seen as well under his Virginia Convention speech that we've read, and Thomas Paine. Alright, next up we have 1800 to 1860, which is Romanticism. During this time we have the industrialization of the world, and we also have, of course, our good old gold rushes, moving on to the West, all that good stuff. Romanticism valued feeling, intuition, idealism, and inductive reasoning. So not deductive, but inductive. So you find it from within. They shunned artificiality of civilization, and they had a focus on nature. Focus on the unspoiled form of nature. Also, typically they saw poetry as the highest expression of imagination. So you'll see lots of poetry from this time. One good example, well, it's not poetry, but one good example of Romanticist story is, of course, the Scarlet Letter. So some notable authors to think about would be Nathaniel Hawthorne, the creator of the Scarlet Letter, Washington Irving, and Emily Dickinson, which was a notable poet. All right, moving on. During around this time period, we also had this thought of transcendentalism. So this basically just meant everything in the world, including human beings, is a reflection of the divine soul. So people use their intuition to behold God's Spirit, and it's usually revealed in themselves or in nature. Also, it focused on a very important thing called self-reliance and individualism. These things were more important than civilization or tradition. So relying on oneself other than others. Next up, we have some notable authors would be Ralph Waldo Emerson, or Henry David Thoreau, and I'll spell that for you. Now we have from 1850 to 1900 would be realism. This was during both the Civil War and Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, post-Civil War here. This is when we started getting feelings of disillusionment. So maybe our government isn't out for everybody. Maybe all of a sudden we aren't going to all be successful. So it focused it on common subjects, so commoners, such as those in the slums, so poor people, and represented the manner and environment of everyday life. So no more fairy tales, no more things that happen to just the rich people. We're focusing on just average Joes. Some examples of this would be, and I have a terrible picture right there that I drew of Mark Twain, Jack London, and Kate Chopin. We'll look at all of these as we go on this year. All right, moving along. We have from 1900 to 1950 would be modernism. So this is between World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. So that disillusionment gets worse as we see a loss in faith of the American dream. Which led to another emphasis of independence or self-reliance. So this ended up leading to interest in the inner workings of a human mind. So we started seeing stories about people's specific thoughts. A good example would be over in Great Gatsby. So notable authors during this time would be F. Scott Fitzgerald. I can spell that right for you. It would probably help. William Faulkner, which we will deal with A Rose for Emily shortly. and John Steinbeck. All right. Also during this time period, we have from 1920 to 1940 what is called the Harlem Renaissance, which was a response to the Roaring Twenties, the jazz movements, and of course the black cultural movements in New York. So this was a direct response to the black cultural movement in New York. Most of the poetry rhythms were based on spiritual and jazz. So was spiritual and based on jazz movements. And then other poetry used conventional lyric forms. So honestly, this was the beginning of rap. Alright, some notable examples would be Claude McKay, and Langston Hughes, who was a great poet, and Zora Neale Hurston. All right, finally, we have 1950 to the present. So we've gone through the Vietnam War, Korean War, the Iraqi War, all these other type of things. It's called contemporary, or another word for it is postmodernism. So it's it's influenced by studies of media, language, and information technology. So it's a direct response to this. So you start seeing things like blogs, internet posts, good stuff like that. It's a sense that little is unique. Now we all believe that nothing is new. They're all just variations of other stories. So little is unique. Culture endlessly duplicates and copies itself. But that leads to new literary forms and techniques. So works composed only of dialogue, or combining fiction and nonfiction, or even experimenting with the physical appearance of their work. So some notable authors, of course, are E. Cummings, Maya Angelou, Sandra Cisneros, and Amy Tan. All right, so in conclusion, we've gone over 9 different periods of literature in our country, starting from the Native American period, Puritanism, Rationalism, Romanticism, Transcendentalism, Realism, Modernism, Harlem Renaissance, and Contemporary or Postmodernism. We've also looked at aspects of each period. So characteristics of why they're so important, why we're able to define them as from that period. So keep this in mind for tomorrow. We'll use this for our quiz and for our next activity. Thank you for listening.